Welcome to another episode of the GayBarchives Show, where we explore gay history, one bar at a time. I'm your host, Art Smith, and our guest today is Eboné Bell, publisher of Tagg Magazine, who will be recounting memories of her DC bar experiences, including Phase 1, Nation, and Tracks. Welcome, Eboné.
Hello. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Are you quite welcome? I'm looking forward to hearing about some of your experiences from the DC bars that you've had the opportunity to go to over the years.
Yeah, I'm excited. I feel like this is somewhat of a win-win for me as well because I get to take a walk down memory lane. So thank you for having me and wanting to talk about this.
You're quite welcome. So I understand one of the bars that I've heard about from a few different people that has a little bit of a special place in your heart is a women's bar that was called Phase 1. What was Phase 1 like?
Oh, Phase 1 was around before I even came out. It was at the time, it was the longest running lesbian bar in the country. I was located in Southeast DC. It was open for a little over 40 years and they closed in 2005. But man, Phase, it just was a rite of passage, I feel, for like a lot of lesbians and queer women at the time. It was this kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of hole in the wall bar, but still like ours, if that makes any sense. So it wasn't really large, but it was just enough. Where we had a dance floor, a bar, there was a pool table, and then there was a thing that everybody took pictures in the bathroom. There were two stalls and something about the bathroom and the red walls. It was like a thing that people took pictures in the bathroom, but it was just such a cool space. And I can't imagine for the women that came before me, how necessary and needed that space was. Because like I said, I'm 40 years old now, but the bar was open way before I even know who I was and how I identified. But what I thought was really cool about Phase 1, they didn't have windows, you couldn't see through, it was just a door and kind of somewhat of a dark space. And a lot of that was for protection. For the women coming into the bar. And they also had rules where, if a man came in, they had to be accompanied by a woman. And they really put a lot of thought into how do we make this safe and how do we make this a fun space. And Phase is just, there'll never be another place like Phase. It was super eclectic, different people from all walks of life, different ages. You never knew what you were going to get when you went to Phase. You meet different people from all different backgrounds. And it was just different people every night when they were open. And I thought that was just the coolest thing. Everything from drag king shows to I held events there myself for Pride, women's events, and burlesque shows to just, a fun happy hour night. Playing some pool. They even had Jello wrestling as well. But it was so much fun, and there just will be nothing like it. But I think so many people in our community, especially lesbians and queer women, probably have so many fun stories from Phase that they probably could share with you. It really was our lesbian cheers.
And it sounds a little bit unusual from what I've heard of a lot of the women's bars and men's bars for that matter. When you're going back, apparently they opened around 1965 or somewhere in that range. And a lot of the bars back then, whether they were for men or women, were pretty segregated, and not necessarily by design, but by virtue of the neighborhoods they were located in and the people that they hired and so on. A lot of them seemed to have mostly young white men or, 30 something women of color or, specific demographics. But from what you're telling me, Phase one was very mixed as far as the women were concerned. It could be a 21-year-old white girl or a 52-year-old black woman or anything in between. But it was for women, not, for the general population.
Exactly. It was for queer women and lesbian identified folks. And yeah, you nailed it. Exactly. It was, you'd see a 21-year-old young white woman, and you can get a black queer woman in her 50s for sure. You just never knew who was going to be there. The bartenders, of course, and the people that worked there were always pretty consistent, and that was always a nice thing to have folks that you can always kind of rely on. So even if you didn't know anyone, you at least knew the people that worked there and the bartenders, who are always pretty friendly as well. But it was a great mix. And I think especially probably for 60s, 70s, 80s, like, if you really think about it, it's not like there was a lot of places to go, especially for lesbians and queer women. So if phase was the only thing, then that's where you're going to go. You don't really have a choice, Now,
it was the kind of bar I gather that, there's a bar in Atlanta that I was very familiar with, and their tagline was a bar with a sense of community. Mm-hmm. And I'm guessing that applies to phase one as well, that it was very much a community-oriented bar. They were involved in organizing groups and events and possibly protests, helping people kind of share their views about political issues and things. So it's really a community-oriented bar, as opposed to somebody just looking to collect money from lesbians for drinks.
Right. Yeah, exactly. They did so many fundraisers, and like I said, I held a handful of events there, and a good amount of them was to raise money for Capitol Pride, or maybe Wanda Alston House, or our scholarship fund, or whatever the case might be. There's so many things and so many ways that they stepped up. I think what was really cool and unique about phase is who started it. Who opened it, and it was two gay men. And I know it was Alan, and I can't remember his partner's name. Unfortunately, his partner passed away pretty early. But they felt there needed to be a space for women. And how often does that even happen, that, anyone is like, hey, that's not a woman. I'm going to open up a space for lesbian and queer women. That doesn't happen often. But to think that there were two men in the 60s that saw, hey, women need a space, there's nothing here, and created it for them, is absolutely amazing. And then they put women at the forefront. The bartenders, the staff were all people who look like us. And I just think they did a really tremendous job with that. And I think it says a lot about who they were and that sense of community.
Now, why did they close after 40 years? What was the reason for them not staying open?
I think the owner just kind of, he was getting older and he was kind of over it, for a lack of a better word. And I can understand that. And I believe he was probably getting some, I don't want to say deals, but people looking to purchase the space. And I think it was just time. It was time. It was really unfortunate, though, because I know that one of the bartenders, Angela, who now is Archer, transitioned not too long ago, I know wanted to kind of take over, and that didn't happen. And we were really hoping that he would hand over the reins to somebody in the community. But in full transparency, I don't know the exact reason why that didn't happen. I think there would have been a great opportunity there. We could still have phase one open, but it just didn't work out. And I think the owner just was ready to go.
A little bit of burnout.
Yeah, it happens. I want to say he was in his, at least his 70s.
Yeah. And that, 40 years is a very long run for any bar, and particularly gay or lesbian bars. You don't typically see them lasting that long.
No, you don't. It really, DC, we have amazing history here. You know, we really, really do. To have one of the longest lesbian bars, like who can say that? Just like you said, even any LGBTQ bar. I just think it says a lot about what they did. You know, we had over here, we also had the longest running drag king troupe, the DC Drag Kings, you know, who performed at Phase One and a couple other establishments in DC, Chaos and Apex. So it's just really cool to see how the DC LGBTQ community has such a rich history here. And they did something right, you know, Phase One did something right where it could last that long. And I'd be interested to know who now is the longest running lesbian bar, who's been open the longest now that Phase One is closed. I want to say it's one of the bars in New York.
That is probably true. You mentioned something about a drag king troupe, and a bar called Apex. And I know those both have a special place in your heart. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Apex and the Drag Kings?
Sure. So Apex was located on P and 22nd in Northwest DC. It's it's called the DuPont neighborhood. And years ago, it was considered the gayborhood as well. There's the fireplaces over there. And then just a few blocks away, there were some other places like Chaos, Cobalt, JR's. So it really was like the gayborhood. But I remember the first time that I went to Apex. I was in college. I want to say I was 20 or 21. I think I was 20 years old. But Apex every now and then did an 18 and overnight. So it was fantastic. It was like a college night. And I remember walking in with a friend who invited me, and the place is packed. And you walk in, and on the bar, there was a long bar at the time. They eventually changed it to a stage. But there was a drag king. I want to say his name was Johnny. I want to say it's like Johnny Katz or something along those lines. I feel so bad that I can't remember, but hopefully it will come to me. But I remember just stopping and watching this drag king on this makeshift bar stage and just looking up. And then another performer coming up, and I turned to my friend and I was like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. This is the coolest thing. You know, I love dancing, performing, and in somebody who doesn't quite fit the mold of, you know, like a feminine woman, you know, I'm more of masculine and presenting. So I've always wanted to perform and dance and always had a love for that. But I never wanted to, you know, wear dresses and do that. So when I saw the DC Kings, I felt like I saw the light. Like I was like, oh my God, this is exactly what I want to be doing. This is going to be me. So fast forward, because of that show, because of Apex, I winded up joining the DC Drag Kings. And the DC Drag Kings, as I mentioned before, was the longest running drag king troupe in the country. It was like 15 plus years until, unfortunately, they dismembered as well. But Apex was one of the homes. It was a monthly, I think it was the first Saturday of the month, ladies' night, and always had the drag kings there. It was always packed and such an amazing atmosphere. Like everyone was super supportive, from the crowd to my fellow drag kings. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say what my name was. My drag king name was E. Clef, because Ebony's my name, so I had to have an E in there, and Clef because I love music so much. So I decided to name myself E. Clef. But Apex was such a great space for Liquid Ladies and Ladies Night. And then also because of the Drag Kings, I was introduced to Club Chaos, which was on Q and 17th in Northwest, that same kind of DuPont neighborhood area. And every Wednesday was Ladies Night, and every first Wednesday was the Drag King show. It was packed every single Wednesday. You go down to this, down these steps into this like little place, and we're just all packed in there, like no windows or anything like that. But we didn't care because we just had somewhere to go. I remember the first time just kind of engaging with people there, because when I first came out, I was hanging out with my gay boyfriends and, hanging out with the gay boys. And then eventually I was like, I need to find some women around here. And because of being a part of the DC Kings and Chaos and Apex, like I was really able to find a sense of community. That's what these bars did for us back then. And not to say they're not doing it now, but at the time, I was younger. I was in my 20s. I came out when I was like 19 years old. So I was searching for a sense of community. And back then, that's exactly what these spaces did for us. It allowed us to meet other people and join organizations and go to different events and volunteer with different organizations, all because we showed up at Apex, or we showed up at Chaos, or we became part of this amazing drag king troupe. So yeah, Apex was just, it used to be called Badlands. I can't remember when it changed over, but it was actually Badlands, and then it became Apex. And then unfortunately, like a lot of bars and clubs in this area and across the country, eventually sold, and they're now apartments or condos or something like that. But I'm so grateful for that space. I'm so grateful. I've met friends that I still talk to this day, people that I've dated, and, all kinds of things. So I'm just grateful for the sense of community those spaces really gave us, and just to have fun too. Because really, that was a big part of going out.
Absolutely. Now, was Apex as integrated as phase one? Was it also a very mixed crowd, young, old, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, or was it more concentrated in one particular demographic?
I think depending on the night, it was it was certain groups. So Apex was, pretty smart in realizing, different segments of the community. So as I mentioned, the nights that I would go, majority was Saturdays because it was ladies' night. But during ladies' night, I would say majority of the time, it was probably like majority of folks were in their 20s, early 30s. So not as diverse in background age as phase one. So it was definitely maybe more of a young professional-ish type crowd. But they also had Latin night. They had college night. College night was a good mix of men and women because college kids, everything was 21 and up, or everything now is 21 and up. So that was always kind of a diverse crowd because these were young people who just wanted to get out and meet other queer folks. And then I know they had some other nights that I can't remember offhand, but I think they did a good job of recognizing different groups that needed spaces. Because if you were a gay man, especially a white gay man, you could walk into any of these places, and see someone who looks like you. But I guess what Badlands / Apex did is they recognized, hey, there's a Latinx queer community here that's super strong. And those nights were very popular. Other locations too, college nights, and of course women's nights. So they really did a great job of recognizing who needed those spaces.
How long did Apex last, roughly?
Say that again?
How long did Apex last? Do you have an idea?
I don't. I want to say they opened either late 80s, early 90s, and then they closed not too long after phase one, because phase Apex, let me back up, it was Badlands. So that's either late 80s, early 90s, and then you come into the early 2000s is when they changed over to Apex. Then the owner of phase one, Alan, who I mentioned, wind up buying Apex and changed it to phase one of DuPont. So he wanted to make this into a lesbian and queer women's space with some one-off events here and there as well. But unfortunately, he didn't have that for too much longer. I want to say phase one in Southeast closed in 2005. I think phase one of DuPont maybe closed shortly, maybe a year or two after that, unfortunately.
You also mentioned another bar that was important to you in that same general time frame, and that was called Nation. And that was a general population gay bar, right? That was male, female, everything.
Yeah, I mean that was the one that you probably see different ages, looks, backgrounds, everyone, and they. I think they also did pretty well because they had certain nights that you could be 18 and over. So for me and my friend Mike, that was perfect. You know, we were going to University of Maryland at the time and wanted to hang out with other LGBTQ folks. And Nation was perfect for us because we were 19, 20 at the time and just kind of coming out. But I will say Nation probably majority, if I had to give like a split of sorts, majority of the time, depending on the night you like go in, I would say probably was 70% men and 30% women. But it's literally kind of where I started my nightlife scene for my queer nightlife scene was Nation. I joke about how my mom got me my first credit card when I was like, I don't know, 18 or 19. She wanted to teach me how to budget. It was like $200 limit. Clearly did not trust, and that's okay. I wouldn't have trusted me either back then. But she would get the statements, and the statements would be like Nation, 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 Nation. And she's like, do you want to tell me what Nation is? So anyway, that was another fun way to also come out to my mom. But yeah, it was such a great time. They had things like foam parties. We could never do that now these days with COVID, but they did like foam parties and big drag performances and techno nights. And I want to say they did like hip hop nights and all kinds of things. And of course, 18 and over. But Nation was located in like Southwest DC, where the Nats field is now, the Nationals, the baseball team. But literally that's where I came out before I even went to Apex or Chaos or even knew these other places existed, just because I didn't know a lot of women at the time. My friend Michael and his boyfriend at the time, Patrick, they were my go-to. They were my safety net. So wherever they were going, I was going. But honestly, I could care less, whether it was men or women. I just wanted to be with my people. So to speak, and feel safe and feel free and dance with other people. And man, I feel like so many memories from Nation. Some not so great as far as maybe being thrown out a couple of times at Nation. Maybe that was a rite of passage. I'm not quite sure, Art, but I definitely was thrown out a couple of times, but definitely walked my happy self right back in there the next weekend and had a great time. But it was just so much fun. Just a great time to just let go, and a huge space. I'm sure you've already talked to people about Nation. I mean, it was like a big warehouse. You walk in and there's this big open room where there's music or whatever. There's the first DJ and this huge bar, and then you go further back and there's another room with another DJ, and that's usually where majority of folks were, because that's where like the music was hype and everything. But it was such a great space and a great feeling, and I appreciate coming out with my lesbros, as I like to call them, but eventually I had to make my way over to the ladies' art because, that's who I wanted to be around, and that's who I was attracted to. But I feel like I always joke and say Nation made me like the gay man / lesbian that I am today.
The self-proclaimed lesbro.
Yes, exactly.
Now, I've noticed through the research I've done of all these bars all across the country that used to exist, I've documented pretty well about 1,700 of them that don't exist anymore, and the list keeps growing. I mean, I have another 1,000 bars to research in Chicago alone. I have a list, I just don't have any information about them. But so far, what I've noticed with a lot of them, and you can correct me if your experience is different, is that in many cities, where they did have lesbian bars, the women's bars tended to be smaller community bars, and the lesbians were almost forced to go to clubs like Nation to experience the grand dance bar experience, because there were not lesbian bars that I'm aware of that were huge spaces with gigantic dance floors and, all that. Is that true? Is that pretty much consistent with your experience?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I guess I never really thought about it. I think the only space that was like that for us was Apex, but that wasn't a lesbian queer women's bar. It was for everyone. But on first Saturdays or Saturdays, it was for us. And so it gave us that nightclub, larger than life on the dance floor or stage type of feeling. But you're right, actual bars dedicated to women, lesbians, and queer women. No, I've never seen one, especially here in DC or other travels, going to other places. I've never seen one. And I'm pausing because I'm like, I've never really thought about it that way. But I also think women, it's also a different culture, if that makes any sense. Not to say women don't dance, but we also don't go out as much as our gay male counterparts. And so I think some of it is also that. We just kind of tend to want to just go out and connect and talk, and of course dance and drink and have a good time. I don't want to make it seem like lesbians and queer women are boring, but I just think it's a different mindset, and I think that's exactly why we've seen that. I've always said, and this could be unpopular opinion, but I don't think that just the lesbian and queer women's community could sustain a large nightclub every week, every weekend. And that's just because, again, it's just that we're just different from our gay male counterparts. We just don't go out as much. They joke about us and say, we U-Haul, and once we're with the partner, we just stay in and, whatever. And obviously, that's a stereotype that doesn't apply to everyone. But I think some of it is just that. It's just a different culture and mindset. And I think lesbians have always also had that community building as well. I think that's just kind of been ingrained, before I even existed. I think we saw that when we started seeing the AIDS crisis happen, and lesbians and queer women stepping up for their gay brothers during that time, and really organizing, through ACT UP and other places, and helping. And I think women have always in our community had that sense of advocacy and community. So it doesn't really surprise me that we haven't had this large nightclub anywhere. I think we've always just really enjoyed real connection, if that makes any sense.
It absolutely does. I had my first gay bar experience before you were even born. It was near you though. My first gay bar experience was in 1977 in Baltimore at a club called the Hippo.
Yes, Club Hippo, yes.
It was an awesome club. I will never forget that experience. But knowing that from the 70s all the way up into the late 80s, I frequently went out. I mean, very frequently, sometimes 4 or 5 nights a week. And I know from my personal experience, as well as the experience of my friends, that a lot of male activity in the bars was geared partially at hanging out with like-minded souls and knowing you had a community, but a large part of it was going out to get lucky. I mean, that was your goal. If you could go out 5 nights a week and go home with 5 different guys, then you had this huge plume of feathers in your cap. It was a big deal. And women typically haven't been like that. Women have typically not made it a goal to go out and sleep with a different woman every night. And I'm not judging whether that's better or worse. I'm just saying, as you know, my observations, it was a different concept. And partially, I'm sure it was influenced by society, because for decades before you ever went into a bar, women were kind of trained, almost brainwashed, to be different than men. You know, men could run around with their shirts off and they could do all this stuff and it was okay. But if women were too sexual, if you wore a plunging neckline or, you know, something that was a little bit too tight, people immediately, you know, slapped that scarlet A on your chest and you were judged for it. And I think some of those heteronormative concepts actually worked into the gay bar scene, because before you became, you know, active in the lesbian bar scene, a lot of lesbian bars, you were almost labeled, you had to be a butch or a femme. And, you know, it was very much categorized, whereas the gay bars were never like that. Gay bars, they didn't really put that kind of pressure on. So it was a different, I think part of it was societal pressures. Part of it may be, you know, the so-called maternal instinct, where, you know, mothers are more caring and loving and emotional, and fathers are more, you know, distant and have a different type of relationship with their friends and partners. So it's hard to say why, but it does seem to be the case. And it seems to have something to do with why right now in 2022, we are now in a situation where there's only a handful of lesbian bars left in the country. You know, I mean, they're just not there. And I think part of it is women are going to bars that men go to. And I think part of it is that, you know, the culture is just evolving.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Everything you're saying, I'm, you know, in the back of my mind, I'm like, man, there's some probably real psychology behind what you're talking about, you know, just like as a mainstream society, you know, and how women are supposed to conduct themselves or whatever has absolutely probably seeped into LGBTQ community. So everything you're talking about, I'm like, there's probably some real psychology behind it. And that's a whole nother conversation for another time. But yeah, I think some of the fact that some of these bars, especially lesbian and queer women's spaces, are closing is, you know, we're becoming more mainstream and accepted. And so some of these, for lack of a better term, straight bars are welcoming people in. And they're having, you know, queer women's nights, or, you know, it's just become a thing. Like I'm part of a queer trivia, and our trivia doesn't take place at a lesbian bar. It takes place at just, you know, some random bar. But I think people want to be able to have options too. Like we love our community bars and we want to support them, but we want to be able to go, you know, to other places and experience different type of, you know, ambiances and things like that. So I think that's a big part of it as well, is we have more options now. And yeah, of course, you know, maybe going to the gay men's bars too, as well. You know, everybody wants different options. You don't want to just, you know, eat the same thing every day, right? So I think that's a lot of it. And I think it also goes back to what I'm talking about with, you know, again, you won't find a lot of women going out all week. But, you know, if I were to line up some gay men here in this area and line up some lesbian, self-identified lesbian and queer women and did a poll on how often they go out, guarantee the women are going to be less, for sure. And I think it just goes back to that as well. I think it's just a combination of things. It's really unfortunate because I think we still need those spaces. And I think back how important those spaces were to me as a young queer woman coming out, and the people that I met in the sense of community. And I know we have, another thing, Art, is we have the internet. We didn't really have that before.
Right.
We didn't have Facebooks and whatever, where we could just pop in a social group and say, hey, let's all have a queer movie night or whatever. So now it's a little bit different. We have all of that. We can gather people at somebody's house or any establishment. We used to have something here in DC. It was a group of gay men and queer women. It was called Gorilla Queer Bar. And they would pick a location and just tell people to just show up and let's just gay it up there. And I thought it was like the coolest thing ever. I'm not quite sure exactly where I was going with that. But anyway, we had Gorilla Queer Bar, and I just thought it was the coolest thing ever as far as having different options and things out there. But we had the internet and people could just put that out and say, hey, this is where we're going to meet. We didn't have that before. So we really relied on these establishments for sure. But we've just become a little bit more mainstream. And I think that's what we're seeing right now.
Absolutely. And despite the fact that the number of lesbian bars are diminishing across the country, you have a couple of friends right there in DC who are in the process of opening a new bar called As You Are. They're a lesbian couple by the name of Rach and Joe, as I recall. And they're opening a club called As You Are, which is going to be a very broad spectrum bar. They're welcoming pretty much everyone. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that project, what you know about it, and what you think about it, because obviously it's going to be a new venue that you can go to.
Yeah. So I don't even know where to start. I think it's absolutely amazing. Anyone who wants to take on opening an establishment, especially during this time, but especially for, it is open to everyone. And I believe majority of the people will probably identify as LGBTQ women and non-binary folks. But what I appreciate about them is they've been paying attention to what's been going on and how even certain people within our LGBTQ community are treated in our own spaces. It is no secret that someone who looks like me, a Black queer woman or just a Black queer person, we can go to a bar and get passed up by a bartender just because of how we look, or this misconception that Black people don't tip, or whatever the case might be. There are just some problematic things, and that's a whole different conversation for another time. But they really started to see this and how people were treated, or just queer women in general. It doesn't matter if you're a person of color or not. And so they were like, we deserve to have something better, something where people feel safe and they feel included, no matter how they identify or how they look. Hence the name, As You Are. Come as you are. It doesn't matter. You'll be treated exactly the same. You'll be treated like a human being that you are. So just the concept around why they're doing it is amazing in itself. And I feel like we need more of that. I think we have bars and clubs that say they're inclusive, but when you go in, that's not what you experience at all. Even if it's a gay man's bar, it doesn't matter. I should be able to walk in and be treated like anyone else. And it's unfortunate that's not always the case. And it's unfortunate that it's within our own community. So I think what they're doing is amazing. I think, when are we talking right now? It's January 2022. They should be open probably in the next month or so. And I know they have a lot of things in the works. You mentioned how lesbian and queer folks are really community oriented. I think that's exactly what's going to happen, is we're going to see some community events. We're going to see fundraisers. Of course, we'll see some great parties. We'll see, maybe poetry nights or things like that. I know that they've done a really great job of already reaching out to kind of the promoters, movers and shakers, people who do events, to say, hey, what would you want to do here, which I think says a lot. They've even did a Q&A with the neighbors in the neighborhood that are going to be around, the establishment, which I should say is actually located just less than a block from where phase one was located, right on the same street, 8th Street Southeast in DC, which I think is so cool. It used to be Banana Cafe, which was owned by 2 gay men. And Banana Cafe was like kind of like a piano bar on top, and the bottom was like a Mexican restaurant. Super cool. So to be able to kind of take over that space again, or have queer owners is just really cool. But I think there's going to be a lot of great things that come out of As You Are. And it's just nice to have somewhere else to go, to have another option. And I say another option because I think it's been 2 years now. Just 2 years ago, we had another bar open up called A League of Our Own, right next to Pictures. And it's a gay man named Dave, who, very similar to Alan and his partner phase one, that said, hey, I'm getting women all the time asking where to go, and there's nowhere to go. So he decided to create a space for lesbian and queer women. And it's kind of cool. It's, one big building, but it's kind of split in half. And so Pictures is on one side, and then A League of Our Own is on the other. But then the dance floor is shared by everyone, which I think is super cool. But as you can imagine, majority of the time, it's majority men on Picture side, and majority queer women and non-binary folks on the other side. So it's just really cool. We have this space, but now we're going to have something else. And again, it's just nice to have options. Every now and then I want to be around my folks, but I just want to sit and I just want to chill. I don't really want to dance, or maybe I do want to go out and dance. So to have different options is just really nice. And especially a place that I can walk in and know that I'm going to be treated like a human being.
Absolutely. And speaking of movers and shakers and making spaces for the LGBTQ community, you have another hat that you wear besides the gay bar aficionado, and that is a magazine that you started called Tagg Magazine.
Yes.
My understanding is that Tagg started out as a magazine for DC lesbians predominantly, and has evolved, much like the concept of other bars that you visited, into something that embraces the entire lesbian, queer, rainbow community.
Yeah, you nailed it.
A little bit about the story of Tagg.
You nailed it. So we actually are celebrating 10 years this year, technically September 2022. So 10 to 11 years ago, I decided to leave my job and start this magazine. And it was because our other publications here in DC at the time was very white, gay, male focused. And that's fine. If that is your audience, I get it. But I wanted to see people who look like me. I wanted to see more queer women. I wanted to see more queer women of color. And I thought, we need something here. We need something to tell our stories, because our voice is just as important as anybody else's in this community. I want somebody to create something that leaves some sort of footprint, history here. And so I left my job. I was working at AARP at the time. And I just decided to take the plunge because I wanted to give a voice to LGBTQ women. So we started off here, local free publication for pickup, DC, Maryland, Virginia. Anyone who's familiar with the area, they call it the DMV. It's kind of all the same. And at the time, our tagline was your connection to the DC lesbian community. Well, that changed pretty quickly, probably about a year and a half into the publication, because one, feedback, of course, from readers, community members, but realizing our community is changing. And there were people that didn't identify as lesbians. They identified as queer women. Of course, there are trans women, bisexual women, and folks that are non-binary. So within about a year and a half, we decided to change our tagline to not your connection. Technically, it's Tagg Magazine, Tag You're It. But it's basically for everything lesbian, queer, and under the rainbow, because we really wanted to capture that. We wanted to make sure that people knew we were telling all of our stories in our community. It wasn't just lesbian identified people. And so after a while, I also realized we don't have a lot of queer women's publications in the country, period. And when I say publications, I mean actual print. As of today, we are only one of 2 print publications left in the country dedicated to LGBTQ women.
Wow.
So that's when I thought, hey, everybody should have access to this. Let's do, let's offer print subscriptions across the country. Let's stop just being DC focused. And let's tell everyone's stories. I always joke and say my job is to tell every queer women's story that I possibly can, before this ride is over. So started Tagg September 2012, our first issue. And since then, we've continued to be that connection for people, provide resources. We also do in-person and virtual events to connect people. And of course, we have great interviews and content for our readers, see the covers and things behind me, everything from Edie Windsor, who is behind me, to Niecy Nash and her wife. And also we do a issue called Enterprising Women, where we spotlight queer women across the country doing amazing things. I feel like I have one of the coolest jobs. I get to meet people and talk to people and learn from people that are doing great things in our community. And I'm able to do all of that through the magazine.
I can relate. It's much like my project. I have gotten to talk to so many interesting people that have stories to tell about interesting bars that are part of our history. And much like your content, documenting the lives of all these queer women, much of the gay bar history has been brushed under the carpet. Everybody wanted to talk about the riots, the revolutions, the politicians, and the bars, which made us a community, which helped us come together and, empower us to combat the HIV crisis or any of the other political issues that have come up, have just been forgotten. So it's so interesting when you get to talk to these people, talk to people like you, who I never would have met otherwise, and hear about some of your stories and help remember some of the things that, that shaped your future. Had you never walked into a gay bar, had you never met another woman of color, lesbian, you probably never would have had a Tagg Magazine. And all these other people that you featured never would have been featured because you wouldn't have been there.
Literally, you nailed it. I always say, I believe everything that happened before led me to this point. I know it for a fact. The bars and that sense built a sense of community. I eventually, with the DC Kings, led me to doing events. I started a queer prom for 21 plus. Which led me to something else, which eventually led me to Tagg Magazine. I don't think if I didn't have any of that experience, any of that sense of community, any chaos, Apex, Phase 1, I know for a fact Tagg wouldn't exist. So I'm grateful that there's somebody like you to document this history. It's really important, and it's a big reason that Tagg exists. I want, 20, 30, 40 years from now, some young queer person to come across the magazine, pick it up, and get to learn about the people that came before them, what was going on in January 2022. I think it's so important for us to make sure that we're always keeping track of our history. So this is an honor to talk to you and be a part of GayBarchives. I really appreciate what you're doing, and I appreciate you having me.
Well, thank you. It has truly been a pleasure listening to your stories about gay bars from your past and learning a little bit about the history of Tagg Magazine. At the end of the video, I'll put up all the links and information so people can stalk you online and connect with you and subscribe to the magazine. But thank you very much, Eboné.
Thank you.
That concludes another episode of the GayBarchives Show. For more information about this episode or to find more episodes, visit GayBarchives.com.